Hello, I'm excited to welcome you to the DisOrient Asian American Film Festival of Oregon. My name is Pamela Kwan, and I'm the executive director. This is our 16th annual film festival, if you could believe that. And over the years, the staff and I have received lots of feedback from people who just walk up to us and they tell us, we saw a film you showed about 5 years ago, 8 years ago. And I just want to tell you how meaningful that film was to me because I had no idea of this part of my history. And they're still talking about it so many years later. I have a feeling that the next three films will have that same impact on our audiences. And I'm really pleased to introduce the filmmakers of Ghost Mountain, Keep Saray Home, and Cambodia Town Not for Sale. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank
Lovely
you.
to be
It's
here.
great to be here.
Great. And hello, Bun-Seng Taing. Nice to have you as well. The trajectories of Cambodian Americans and Vietnamese Americans in all three of your films are very much connected. We have from the film Ghost Mountain, director and writer James Taing and his father and one of the subjects of the film, Bun-Seng Taing. And we'll also be talking with Brian Redondo from Keep Saray Home and Brandon Soun from Cambodia Town Not for Sale. I'd like to start in maybe chronological order and start with the 1970s and Ghost Mountain. Prior to the period where your film begins, James, Cambodia had stability. It had food, there was thriving culture, modern cities. What role did the US play in shaking up that balance?
That's a fun question. I rarely get asked that one. I spent a lot of time learning about this subject matter, which is the geopolitics and the inferno of war that happened from US involvement in Vietnam, which comes at the backdrop of really a Cold War, which was a proxy war between Russia and China and the United States and sort of like a lot of the Western nations. And so there was a lot of pitting between these countries, not within their own countries. We weren't in a direct conflict in China or in Russia, but we did it through these smaller countries, right? And so this culminated in small wars like within Vietnam, and then that later inflamed into places like Laos, and then slowly into Cambodia. Initially, Cambodia had tried to be very neutral, or the king at that time tried to pit or play both sides and align himself as being pro-China, pro-US. And whatever happened, his own people within his own country, the military, felt like he was aligning himself a little too much with the communists and allowing too many Vietnamese who were sort of being shaken out into Vietnam through the bombings by the United States. He was appealing to them too much. So what ended up happening, and this wasn't covered in our film because it's just a huge segment, the killing fields alone, what's happening, he leaves for a trip and his military general goes and takes over in a coup d'etat. And so from then on, there's this new republic that's set up that's very friendly with the US, the Khmer Republic. And then immediately a civil war ensues between the communists and the Khmer Republic. And so what ends up happening is that the U.S. continues to bomb the region, trying to flank out the Vietnamese, Viet Cong, and all of those. What it creates is this creates the best recruitment poster for the communists, because the amount of bombs and firepower that were dropped left million dead, loss of jobs, and was just so much collateral damage that it allowed Pol Pot to say, this is our enemy, right? It's the United States. It's this Khmer Republic. They are very anti-Cambodian, and they're allowing Vietnamese to come in. And
Mm-hmm.
so from then on, they were able to recruit many, many people. And then the tipping point was in an attempt to get back power, the king, Sihanouk, goes and asks the people to fight with Pol Pot and the communists. And
Oh.
suddenly it's endorsed by the king, and everyone joins in mass, at least in the
Mm.
rural areas. Many,
Uh-huh.
and so there's no chance. The public is in support of the communists, and they only take over the country. And henceforth begins this new political experiment with Pol
I
Pot being the purest communist country ever to be instilled, even more pure than Stalin in Russia, more pure than Mao in China, is what
Wow.
Pol Pot prided himself on.
Wow. So that is the backdrop for a lot of these stories, and it's important to understand that going forward. Bun-Seng, there was a point when your son was so determined to make this film, and he wouldn't let up, and he kept pestering you, and you had agreed to do it. But you also knew about the dark stories that you were about to reveal and how intense they were. How did you think that would affect your son when he learned about them?
Well, all these years that I, always telling about my story to the people that I know, and my son sometimes he's overheard what I,
Hmm.
all the story and how I lived through that I make it to the U.S. So it's such a long journey to make it to this country. And one day he come to me and he say, "Wow, your story is very important. You need to tell people
Hmm.
about what happened to the people was get killed uh, by the well get killed after the killing field. It's
Hmm.
not something about the killing field. This is after the killing field story.
Hmm.
That thousands of refugees that escaped from Cambodia and they make it to Thailand refugee camp, and it turned out to be that they forced back to the mountain, and thousands of them are lost their life. And
Right.
my son say, "Wow, you got to do this story to let the world know about it." And I say, uh, "No, I don't want to relive that story again because it's so hard to
Hmm.
live through that story again." And my son never gave up. He said, "Pa, you got to do it. You are capable to tell the story, and you are the survivor that able to tell the story, and you should do it." And I say no. I keep saying that I don't want to relive again. And one thing
Hmm.
he brought up to me, and he said, "Pa, you got to do this for the people that lost their life.
Hmm.
That 12 or 13,000 of them are lost their life. You do it for them." So in that point, that I say, well, I feel guilty that
Yeah.
if I don't want to do the story
Hmm.
uh, because thousands of people die. If I don't do the story would die forever. Nobody ever know about what happened after the killing field. That's how we
Exactly.
follow it. Yeah, yeah.
I see. Well, we appreciate you being here to tell that. Years of bombing and fighting set into motion the displacement of millions and millions of Cambodians, as you mentioned. And you talk about labor camps that come to be known as the killing fields. And there was just unleashed inhumane conditions and torture and starvation of unimaginable proportions on innocent people. James, between you mentioned between the years of 75 and 79, what was the percentage of the population that died either by execution or torture or worse?
It's estimated, I think, in the film we put one third of the
Yeah.
population, which
Wow.
um, originally it was deemed as a pure genocide, which was
Hmm.
against those of the cities, right, the rich of a certain class. And a
Hmm.
lot of this came out of a huge uh, tension between the rich and the poor, the rural and the urban, right?
Hmm.
And as you saw in the film, it was those who were in the cities were living the absolute most modern life. In
Hmm.
even by our standards, like
Yeah.
they lived a life just like us. But there are also those in the rural areas, the farming communities, who had been dealing with war and were the first to be afflicted with this Cold War that took place. And so when the killing fields happened, it was mainly against the urban population, but it quickly grew out of hand. And so those in power became paranoid about those above them, those around them. They're afraid of betrayal and people backstabbing them. So it became what's called a genocide into an auto genocide, which is just mass murder of everybody on every type of scale. And there's nobody they can identify who was getting killed. It's just everybody was a victim at the end there.
Wow, that's incredible. And Bun-Seng, help us understand. You spent time in these camps. Well, first of all, maybe James, in covering the story, how many refugee camps do you think your father had lived in? You mentioned several.
There was just Roca and then Buriram refugee camp.
Okay,
the two he had gone through. Yeah.
And Brian, did one of the subjects of your film, Saray, did he also spend time in a refugee camp?
Yeah, actually, all the subjects have. So Saray, Hua,
and Victoria.
T, Min as well. Actually, Min's the only one that hadn't. But they'd all spent time in refugee camps, and I believe all of them were in Thailand at some point.
Wow.
But yeah, we sort of don't get too deeply into what that refugee experience was like in Southeast Asia. We allude to it, but I know from talking with them, they have some pretty harrowing experiences, even though they were all only children at that time. They're very young children, but they do recall some of those moments, things that happened to other family members, and it's quite an awful situation that I think has traumatized refugee communities in ways that still resonate till today.
Right. And I'm sure, Brandon, you've heard stories of people who have been through refugee camps like this as well. Yeah. And I wanted to ask Bun-Seng, maybe help us understand, when people hear refugee camp, maybe they don't quite understand what the conditions are like. If they don't hear it, they don't know sometimes. Like on a good day, how much food would you get in a refugee camp? Can you remember that?
Well, I mean, after we escaped from Cambodia, we were starving during the communist time. And when we make it to a refugee camp, it's like one of the best place for us. Even we are surrounded by wire, we got fed every day. And so for us, food is plenty, because consider that we all lived through the communist, that many of them starving to death, including myself. So to a refugee camp, to me, is very luxury for me, that I actually enjoy being a refugee camp was then, So food is pretty plenty for us, considered that we are living through starvation. Yeah.
Right. And I was struck by a story you mentioned in one of the camps, where you talked about, even despite the conditions, that you were able to talk with friends, and there was this sense of community there. You mentioned music and talking about your dreams and hopes for the future. That really speaks to the resilience of the human spirit. James, your research turned up U.S. State Department officials, ambassadors, various officials, and even an American nurse who worked at one of the refugee camps. It was really interesting to hear their accounts. How did you meet this nurse, Cheryl, just years later?
Cheryl was friends of McAllen Thompson. And she was the head nurse there. And I was, at the time, Kavi Dang, this was back in 2017, had just actually reopened the actual camp again as a visitor tourist sort of memorial. So you can actually go there today, and there's this one little building with collage of pictures and posters of all these things that the International Red Cross has created there. So I got in touch with Cheryl. She still lives out there in Thailand, Cambodia. Yeah.
Wow.
She's dedicated. She's never left. She's from, I think, this region in New York. And she just took an adventure out there and never fell in love with it and never left. And so these days she's working on advancing healthcare and the education and the healthcare system in Cambodia, particularly, I think. And so she's still very much embedded there. She's a great person. She's told so many stories because she's seen it up close, like people who came in and you just would think are dispirited and just everything's taken from them. And she just could see still like there's this shred of hope that they had and they still kept fighting on. And that sort of thing has carried with her for so long.
That was, a nice balance in your film that you did extensive research to find lots of people on the ground, aid workers, people in governmental positions who could really attest to their viewpoints of the policies and the politics at that time. And it really corroborated what the stories that we heard from many of the refugees.
Yeah. Yeah, originally I wanted to do like a documentary and education film and just have my father as a side story and really tell people about what we did in terms of refugee and relief work and how phenomenal it was and unprecedented it was. And it turned into like more of a personal story of my father, but was able to give tribute to them all in the same respect though.
Yeah. Well, the experiences that we've talked about so far were really horrific, but they pale in comparison to the events at the temple at Pra-Vihir. And this was a story that we've never heard about. I don't know, Brandon, have you ever heard of Pra-Vihir or Brian before maybe this film?
Yeah, I've heard of the temple in Cambodia, but I haven't heard of the events that happened. Yeah.
Well, James, what did you feel when you brought the crew to Pra-Vihir? Were you concerned about the emotional toll it would have on your father and your uncle?
I was more concerned about what we would find there, because I'd only been there a few years prior, trekking around and trying to find where they were dumped and displaced, right? And we ended up at a military barracks, and this is a time where that temple was disputed. Parts of it were disputed between Thailand and Cambodia, so there was some hot skirmishes for a time in that temple, not too long. And I had been there during a period of ceasefire, so I get up there and I meet the military border soldiers there, and they tell me, "Oh, you can come in. There's tons of landmines in there, but we pull out all of this clothing and pots and pans and stuff." So I wasn't able to get in back then. So I was like, okay, next time I go is with a film crew, and I don't know what's going to happen. And I mean, my uncle was very frightened because he had lived through it, and some of the soldiers jumped off the path. And he started screaming, and he's like, my uncle was like, "Don't do that. You're going to set something off." And all of this memories are just flooding back to him. And the soldiers, the general there was like, "It's okay. I walk through here all the time." And he starts pulling stuff out of the ground, and we think it's just foliage and dead grass, leaves and stuff. And it's actually blankets and the clothes and all this stuff. So it was a little tenuous because I didn't know. It was a little bit of a venture for sure.
Yeah. And had your dad been back to Cambodia before this?
Yeah, he had. That was probably his third time.
Okay, but not back to Pra-Vihir.
No, that was the first time nobody has ever tried to enter. That's the first time exclusive footage. And
wow.
I don't think anybody has gone the lengths of actually pinning it down as that being the location until I went about it years prior.
Wow.
The soldiers know about it, and they're like, "Oh, we see this stuff every day." Some people left it behind, but they never knew the full length of the story till we showed up and we started telling them.
Wow, that's amazing. Bun-Seng, well, you know, we see you in the film giving out books to children in your hometown. Is it called Roca Calm? Is that how you say?
Yeah, Roca Calm. Yeah, yeah.
Can you tell me about that scene where you're handing out books to the children there?
Well, that's the hometown that my parent was born, and I went back there after 38 years later, and my parent actually was buried there, and so the hometown haven't changed for all this year since I was a little child. So, and it still see the same that I remember the hometown. So it's just the hometown. I mean, it's poor, but it filled with a lot of happiness that we have so much joy and happy when we was young and playing on dirt and around the Mekong River, you know. So it's such a good memory. Yeah.
Well, this film must have been so difficult for you to make personally, but it's nice that you now have some of these memories of happy children in Cambodia and peace and laughter to deal with and to have in your collection. It took a lot of courage for you to confront this past, and you kept it to yourself for so long. Did you receive some measure of peace and release by releasing these stories?
Yes, I'm. Now I'm happy that we get it and we able to tell the story because all this year that I have a problem about dealing with the story that so many people are dying and that's not so many that nobody know about it about what happened, that 40-something thousand refugees was forced back to that mountain, and it's such a large amount of people that die after the killing field that the world don't know about it, and I'm very happy that we get it done and tell the world about that, what happened after the killing field. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. You make a good point. 43,000-ish people were affected by the events at Pravi here. So please, if you haven't seen the film, watch it and learn about this segment in history.
I mean, 40,000 people that lived through those horrible conditions and after the killing field, and they turned out to be that they sent it to die again. You know, that's what happened.
Yeah, I know. Well, thank you, James and Bun-Seng, for telling us about Ghost Mountain, and you've given us a lot to think about. These were incredible stories of refugees, and when we're going to talk next with Brian Redondo with Keep Saray Home. The subjects of his film are also refugees, and one of the main subjects, Saray, was only 3 years old when he came here. His family's arrival was under these types of traumatic conditions. And if you can imagine losing everything, coming here, not knowing the language, having nothing. And that's where we begin with Keep Saray Home. Welcome, Brian. First of all, I have to say, I was on the edge of my seat watching your film the whole time. It's a riveting story. And one thing that's interesting to me is that Saray was issued a green card, correct?
Yeah, I think that's something that's not always understood with refugees. So, refugees, particularly from Southeast Asia during that period in time, were being brought to the U.S. legally, and we're all given green cards. But unfortunately, there's sort of a lack of education for how they can acclimate their lives once they arrived in the U.S. Right. So there's something I've heard commonly amongst Saray and other people of his age in the community is that they just didn't know that they had to apply for citizenship after they had their green card. You know, they sort of just assume like, okay, we have this legal status, we're green card holders, and that's it. And so you know, when they were young and got into some trouble as youngsters, they were never given the information to know exactly how that would impact their status, their refugee status in being in the United States, and sort of what exacerbations of punishment there would be because of that lack of information.
Right. I mean, I think that's just insane that people might only hear parts of the story and assume, oh, he was an illegal alien, so they put him in this category, you know, but that's not the case. He had legal status as a resident. And how would he know, being 3 years old, what to do with his status, you know? What caused things to change abruptly?
Well, so a lot of folks, you know, unfortunately, when refugees are placed throughout the U.S., a lot of times they might be sent to live in under-resourced communities, and as I said, aren't provided a whole lot of support. Not a lot of education, not a lot of resources. And, you know, I think in Saray's case, as well as in Min's case and T's case, they ended up growing up in environments in which they weren't necessarily welcomed by the people who were already living there. And they also themselves just, you know, didn't have a lot of luxuries and privileges to, you know, kind of advance their lives in ways that maybe they would have liked to. Right? They basically didn't have the opportunities, and so I think confronted by some of those hardships and also by, you know, very outward blatant racism. You know, they found themselves in some trouble. They associated with people maybe that they probably shouldn't have or regretted doing so. In Saray's case, he joined a gang, and you know, and that led his life down a path that I know that he regrets to this day. And then because of how things are in under-resourced communities throughout America, young people get put into the criminal justice system at a very young age. And things sort of just spiral, unfortunately, from there. And so that's how Saray and T and Ming lost their green cards, because they were arrested for a crime, because you know, court-appointed lawyers told them to take plea deals in which they had to plead guilty, and then not realize what the ramifications of that were. And so, you know, unfortunately, they all lost their green cards at some point. And then, you know, now 20 years or decades after those original infractions, they're facing deportation. In T's case, he was deported a few years ago.
Right.
And that these are not isolated incidents within the Southeast Asian community. It's, you know, it's been happening in the Khmer community for a long time, since the early 2000s. And in recent years, there's been an uptick in deportations of Vietnamese refugees as well, of also Lao refugees. So it's becoming more widespread, and that was really the impetus to document what was going on in the community at this point in time.
I could see that. Brandon, you know, Brian's story is on the East Coast. You're on the West Coast. You're probably hearing some of these types of stories too. Would you say that it's common knowledge in your part of the country that these things are happening?
I'd definitely say with the rise in deportations in the recent years from the Trump administration and the recent news that President Biden would hold back on his deportation ban. At least in the Long Beach community, there have been collectives and nonprofits that are doing more increasing anti-deportation work to prevent a lot of our community members in Long Beach from getting deported and being separated from their families.
Right. Well, thank you. So Brian, back to Saray. Despite this really rough start in life, he actually turned it around. Not everyone can do that. He fell in love, he got married, he created this beautiful family, and you shared a pretty great home movie about what his family life is like. Why did they trust you with their story and open up so much of their life to you?
You know, I think it's similar to Bun-Seng's own story. What he was saying about kind of like living with this trauma, but at some point he felt some sort of responsibility to the community and just the events that have transpired to be more forthcoming about it. And I think that is also true in the case of Saray and Tammy. They know it's very uncomfortable for them to be open about the situation that they're dealing with, but they recognize that the power of sharing that story, what that would mean not only for themselves but for the other people that they know, their other friends, their other community members dealing with the same problem, and how impactful that could be. And so, I do think it's a combination of those things that really persuaded them to be involved, right? Like sort of any support that they could get by opening up, they were willing to take that risk.
Wow. Wow. Well, I know that Saray's family credits you and this documentary with helping them get their story out there. That's a testament to you as a filmmaker. And you really, I think you and James both had a main story focus, but you had other stories. And that took some forethought. You showed one man, it was T, I think, who was deported back to Cambodia. What did he experience when he was just dropped back? What did he experience?
Oh, he really struggled. He was dealing with a serious bout of depression, I would say, and diagnosed as well, and had medication specifically for it. And he was a little bit older when he left Cambodia initially, when you know during the whole ordeal that James described. So he has more vivid memories of some of the atrocities that were committed, and so him getting deported back to Cambodia really triggered some of those traumas for him.
Yeah, I would imagine.
He would go driving around the streets and have these intense flashbacks.
Oh my gosh.
And so it was quite a struggle for him being there. But then it was an added burden knowing that his family was still in Lowell, Massachusetts, and his newborn son, he had never met. His young daughter, his toddler daughter, who he was sort of the primary caretaker of his daughter, during the working hours. And so that extrication was such a difficult ordeal for him and his family to deal with, that I really do think it weighed down very heavily on him.
Absolutely.
During his time in Cambodia.
And part of that story, you introduced us to an organization in Boston called the AARW. Can you tell us who they are and what they do?
Sure. That's the Asian American Resource Workshop, and they are a community-based organization in Dorchester, which is actually I'm not sure if it's if it's technically part of Boston or separate, but
South
they're
Boston.
in the greater Boston area. And thanks, James. And so they work on a lot of Asian American issues in that area. I believe they work on housing justice and maybe things around jobs, but they also focus on these anti-deportation issues,
Mhm.
specifically with the Vietnamese and Cambodian communities in the
Mhm.
area.
Yeah.
And they have been very instrumental in organizing impacted community members, helping them find legal support, helping them find monetary support in some cases. They did
Mhm.
fundraisers for T's family to sort of help keep them afloat while
Mhm.
they're in this precarious situation. And then they've also done a great job of rallying community members together to accompany people when they have to go report to ICE, to do rallies and get media attention, and to really let people know about what's going on and try to
Mhm.
prevent these deportations from happening.
Well, that's really important work. And I'm glad to know about that organization. And hopefully people watching this will know that if they need those resources. I saw one scene where the community was rallying around Saray. He has to report once or twice a year to the ICE office. And this was a particularly stressful meeting, and the community was outside rallying. And there was one sign that just really ripped my heart out, and it said, "Stop deporting victims of war," is what it said. And I think that really, really uh, goes to the issue of all of these films, is to understand how all these events were set into motion, and the US's role in dealing with it, and also in uh, being part of the solution, and how to successfully handle all of these human lives. Um, I was impressed with the editing of this film, and I'm sure it was difficult to pick what to keep and what to let go. Was there something that you really wish could have stayed in the film?
Oh, that's a good question. Let me think about that for a second.
Okay.
uh I mean, there was a lot there. I mean, we filmed a couple other people who were in danger of deportation, um, who's who we sort of didn't have enough to tell their full story, so
Yeah.
we weren't able to include them. But I think uh, yeah. Overall, I mean, I think I would have loved um, if we were able to see more of kind of the organizing that was
Mm-hmm.
happening around
Mm-hmm.
all of their stories. Uh, but there's time constraints and also
Yeah.
filming
Yeah.
constraints related to that. But yeah, I mean, I think what we wanted to do was show not just the individuals being impacted, but show how this is a community-wide issue, and that
Mm-hmm.
um, it wasn't just about people sort of being victims of this situation, but about people coming together and making a stand as a community.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully that comes across. But
It does.
there's obviously a lot more that happens in real life than
Right.
what you can condense into a 30-minute film.
Exactly. And I noticed that you dedicated this film to Bayani Redondo. And who is the special person in your life? And was he able to see your work?
That's my dad, who unfortunately passed away last year before we finished the film. And he knew that I was working on this, spending all my spare time trying to work on this film.
Mhm.
And I mean, it's dedicated to him because to me the film is ultimately not about refugees and not
Mhm.
necessarily about deportation, but to me it's about parents and their kids.
Mhm.
Saray talks about how his father wasn't around too much when he was growing up in the States because his dad was off
Oh.
working in all these places and trying to support their family. So that was tough for him, and I think that is a part of the reason why he went down the path to being in a gang. And so for him to then also potentially be removed from his family could send his own children down a terrible path, right? And it,
Right.
it just perpetuates a cycle of broken families.
Mhm.
And so dedicating this to my father, I'm glad that he was around and he was supportive of my work.
Mhm.
And I think that's something I'm hoping audiences will take away from the film, right? Is that keeping those families intact and stopping those cycles from ever happening is what's truly important. And I do think that is hopefully something we can all relate to.
Well said. Thank you. And and I think as we move and hear some of these stories, we can also see how they connect to Brandon Soun's film, Cambodia Town, Not for Sale. Brandon, many of the refugees from Cambodia actually immigrated to California. And it's really important to understand some of the stories that might be similar to what we heard in Ghost Mountain and Keep Saray Home. Um, where is Cambodia Town, Brandon?
So Cambodia Town is within Long Beach, California, and that's right under the city of Los Angeles. Cambodia Town actually has the largest population of Cambodians outside of Cambodia itself,
I
and the
had no
largest
idea.
population of Cambodians in the United States.
Wow.
So, yeah, I grew up. I was born and raised in Cambodia Town. I
Ah,
moved here and there around the city of Long Beach 2 times, but my family would still go to Cambodia Town often just to buy groceries or like eat at restaurants or like go to the hair salon. So we're still really involved with the community. So like when making this film,
that's
it came from a sense of home.
Oh, that's great. I would love to visit someday. And James and Bun-Seng, have you ever heard of Cambodia Town? Have you been there?
I've been to Long Beach a few times, yes.
Oh, you have good food?
It's good food, excellent, good community.
Mhm.
And
That's
lovely.
great.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, in your film, you and your co-director had heard about some rumblings about maybe some buildings being targeted in Cambodia Town. They were tagged for demolition. You made this film as a project through UCLA, right?
Yeah, so I met my co-director Lan. She was a master's student in Asian American Studies at the time, and I was an undergrad.
Mhm,
And we were both born and raised in Long Beach, and
mhm,
we were connected through one of our professors to make the film because I was taking a film class at the time.
mhm.
And yeah, when we first heard the news of the demolition of a Vital Plaza in Cambodia Town, Anaheim Plaza, we were like really, we felt a whole mix of emotions because we went to these, like mom and pop businesses, these hair salons, KH Market, which we covered in the film. Our families grocery shop there all the time, and we know the family that runs the store. So when
Wow.
we first heard about the news, it felt like we were losing a part of our home and a part of our identity. So that's why we decided to make the film, just to spread awareness and like try to do something just to save our community.
Mhm. Well, I remember that sense of community that when I heard Bun-Seng talking about, being in the camp with people he cared about and loved. I mean, I see that same sense of community in your film. And how big was that plaza that was targeted for demolition?
So the plaza, I think it was a whole block.
Okay.
There were a good amount of, it was basically like kind of like a strip mall
Mm-hmm.
of a lot of ethnic businesses, a lot of non-Asian businesses, a lot of Khmer businesses, Vietnamese businesses, Chinese businesses, and The main one was KH Market, but a lot of the shops have become vacant recently too,
Oh.
and that can be attributed to COVID, because of the pandemic. Business and travel to Cambodia town has decreased drastically since the pandemic started, and even though we're trying to save these businesses from being demolished, unfortunately, a good amount of them have been like closed down permanently just due
Sorry
to
to hear
the
that.
pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when these were targeted for demolition, I think the outrage came from the fact that they were given literally no notice. Is that true? I mean, are you talking about tenants or building owners who, how did they receive any communication that this was even going to happen?
hmm So the plaza is owned by, I believe it's like a real estate corporation, and they've owned it since the late 90s. And they, from what I've heard with talking to the business owners, they've done like a lot of shady things to them, just to be honest. Like they've raised their rent without notice, and in the film, like they gave very short to like little notice at all that their businesses would like become demolished, and they had like a couple weeks to move out everything. And
I just can't
yeah,
even believe that.
yeah, after these businesses would be demolished, it was proposed that they would rebuild like a drive-through. I think it was either like a new Whole Foods or like a corporate store. So after hearing that, like these corporations would come into our community and like take space up from like ethnic mom and pop businesses that are like vital to our community, these are like shared spaces, like everyone just felt enraged.
Right.
Yeah.
And you said business leaders, community organizers got together, and how did they act? What did they do?
So in the film, a couple nonprofits in Cambodia town, United Cambodian Community and Long Beach Forward, they organized a community forum that I documented in the film. And we basically just wanted to create like a grassroots organizing movements with not only the business owners that are affected, but also a lot of community residents and people outside of Long Beach who have been invested in the community. And through this community forum, we wanted to provide like legal assistance to these business owners on what to do next if they were to lose their businesses, and also just to get everyone involved, spread awareness of the issue. I know that before the community forum, there was a petition going around just to save all these businesses, and so far, I think it's reached almost like 10,000 signatures. But
That's
that
awesome.
was, yeah, that was at the end of 2019, so it has been a while now.
Right. And many of these business owners, like one of them you said had been there for 36 years. And that would mean maybe they got set up. This was an herb shop in maybe mid 80s or so when they got set up. And you can imagine if her family had gone through some of these stories and some of this history upon arrival, had to rebuild, took several years to do so, and now have this business after starting all over and investing 36 years in a location, that's pretty devastating and really not very kind to treat people. That's not how, you know, that's not how we normally see people treated when they've invested so much into a community. So really, really happy to see the community rallying like that. And you guys have to watch that film. It's great. Thank you so much for sharing all of these wonderful and connected stories. Before we go, I'm just going to go around quickly and see if any of you have any projects you want to tell us about, and maybe we'll go backwards this time and start with Brandon.
So currently I am an Arms with the Camera Fellow with Visual Communications down in Los Angeles. My current project with them is to create a short documentary on Cambodian deportation. And recently, a cohort fellow of mine sent me Brian's film to watch
Funny.
just for inspiration. So like
Right.
after that, I reached out to Brian, just like thanking him and like introducing myself.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
And
That's-
yeah, so that's gonna go on for like the next year and a half. And I've also been working on as an assistant editor for my former professor. His name is Tadashi Nakamura. And
Oh, so
yeah,
Tad will be on a panel in
yeah,
DisOrient, so you guys will have to check that out.
uh-huh,
And he also has a short film in the festival. That's wonderful.
yeah. So the film I'm working on with him right now is on his father, Bob Nakamura. It's called Third Act. Yeah, it's
Ah,
basically a biography of his life and how he's dealing with Parkinson's and how
I see.
Tad and his father can say goodbye to each other.
I see.
Yeah, so those
Well,
are the two main projects I'm working on right now.
we are looking forward to that. That's a great story. And we can go on to James. James, why
Sure.
don't you tell us if you're working on a project?
I think we still have aspirations to make a longer type of form for this film. Right now it's short, and
Uh-huh.
there's so much to it. And what you guys really saw was just like 5% of
Yeah.
really what
I
went
imagine.
down there. So that's one. Otherwise, right now I'm kind of like thinking or planning the next processes about having a museum in Cambodia. And
Uh-huh.
the border soldiers, when we left, said that they would give us land to build it on there. And right before COVID, they called and said, "Hey, what are you guys up to? We still remember you guys." And they mentioned it again. So I think that's a long range goal of mine, is to create a memorial genocidal museum right on that landmark there. And
Uh-huh.
so it would curate things from the field, because people can't go into the jungles there. It's still very much full of mines. It's infested there.
Oh, I
You
can
can see
imagine.
all those 2 miles of tracks of the skull signs everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So what we hope to do is maybe replicate the experience, like walking down a staircase or standing at the edge of some stairwell with some foliage and jungle would make you get the sense of what it was to be on a sheer escarpment like it was for a refugee back there. So
Mm-hmm.
um, right now I'm just in the planning stages for now. That's probably going to be a long thing. I think it's important because I don't want this story buried in history, and having a landmark there, I think, is very important. It will help. Will go a long ways for that.
Yeah. Well, great project idea, and good luck with it. And Brian, are you on?
Yeah, so I am I'm sort of an editor in my day job, and I'm working on another short documentary with another filmmaker who I've collaborated with before on a rehabilitation program in some prisons in the Pacific Northwest, actually,
Mm,
and it's
wow.
kind of an experimental rehab program, and
Huh.
so we're sort of working on that. And then I'm also I just started doing some early pre-production research on another film about Filipino contract workers in the
I
U.S.
see.
So hopefully that'll evolve into something in the near
That's
future.
great. Thank you so much. Your films meant a lot to us. And if for audiences who may not have seen the film by the time they see this Q&A, go out and see it. If you have seen it and you're still within your 24-hour watch window, you can watch it again. There's a lot to unpack here. And thank you so much. We've learned a lot. And we know that these films will reach people in very deep places. And thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having
Thank you
us.
so
Okay,
much.
sure. Thank you.